There's a thing folks never tell you about a dying town. It doesn't die loud. It dies the way a candle goes out in a draft you can't feel, a little dimmer every week, and nobody able to say the moment it happened. I've kept a ledger most of my life. Numbers mostly. Shoes set, nails bought, the weight of iron. I started keeping that ledger because my hands needed something to do that my mouth couldn't be trusted with. And I'm telling you all this up front because what I'm about to lay down is the one entry in that whole book I never could make balance. The spring, a man followed 3 stubborn donkeys into the hills and came back down changed, and dragged the rest of us, blinking and ashamed and weeping, into the light along with him. People in Sweetwater will tell you the story now like they always believed, like they didn't stand in the road and laugh at a savance. I was there. I wrote it down the same day, while my hands were still shaking, because I knew even then that memory is a liar and a coward, and I wanted at least one true account of what those animals did. So stay with me. I'm going to tell it the way it happened, not the way it gets told. And I'll warn you now, the part that shocked this whole town, the thing waiting up that canyon, isn't what you'll guess. I guessed wrong too. We all did. Let me start where it started for me, which is to say in the dust with everybody watching and a man who wouldn't quit. The donkeys came down out of the burned hills at noon, and a savance came down behind them, and the whole town stopped to stare. I remember I had a hoof in my lap when I heard the commotion, old Deacon Bell's plow mule, patient as scripture, and I'd been paring the frog clean. I set the foot down gentle and stepped out from under the linta with the nipper still in my fist, and there he was. You have to understand what we'd become by then, or none of it lands right. It was the 3rd summer of the drought. The Sweetwater itself, the creek that gave us our name, that fed the town and the irrigation ditches and the cottonwoods that used to make the place look like something worth stopping for. The Sweetwater had gone to a string of green puddles back in May, and by July it was a cracked bed you could walk across without wetting a boot. The town well still pulled water, but it came up tasting of old pennies and something underneath that, mineral and bitter the way I imagine a grave tastes. We drank it anyway. We had nothing else. Folks were selling stock at a loss because they couldn't water it. The Hendersons had pulled out in June, and the Cobbs in early July, their wagon piled with everything they owned, the children sitting on top of it not waving, just watching the town go small behind them. So we were not, by that summer, a generous people. Grief makes some men kind. Drought makes most men mean, and we'd had a season of meanness in us, looking for somewhere to set it down. That noon, a savance gave us somewhere. He came walking down the cal stiff-legged and sunburnt, hat gone, hair stuck flat to his skull with sweat, and he was caked to the waist in mud. Mud. In a drought. That's the first thing that stopped people. There hadn't been honest mud in the county since spring, and here was a man wearing it like a second pair of trousers, gray-red and drying to a crust, mud on his hands and mud in the lines of his face, and a streak of it down one cheek like he'd wept it. And ahead of him, leading him, trotting easy with their long ears swinging, came the 3 donkeys. Everybody knew those donkeys. They were a joke by then, a joke older than the drought almost. They'd belonged to Hap Mullins, the prospector, a sour little man who died alone in his cabin the winter before and been found by his own dog 3 days after the fact. Hap had spent 30 years convinced there was silver in the calicos, and spent every dollar he ever scratched up buying more burros to haul out the ore he never once found. When he died, the county auctioned off his effects to settle what he owed the mercantile, and his effects came down to a busted dry washer, a Bible nobody'd ever seen him open, and 3 donkeys that wouldn't be driven, wouldn't be led, and had a documented habit of unlatching their own gate and walking off into the hills in the dead of night for reasons known only to God and donkeys. Nobody bid on them. The auctioneer dropped the price and dropped it again, and finally just looked out over the crowd like a man begging. And a savance, who had buried his own wife 2 springs back and his daughter long before that and had not, to my knowledge, smiled in the entire time I'd known him. A savant raised one finger and bought all three for $1 and the auctioneer's gratitude. People said he was simple. People said grief had loosened something in him. My master, Tobias Reed, the farrier I was bound to, said it plainer than that, leaning on the anvil and spitting. Man's bought himself 3 ways to starve. Because that was the math of it. You can't eat a donkey, not without becoming the kind of man the town talks about. You can't sell what nobody'll buy. All a savant had bought himself was 3 more mouths to water out of a well that was already going bitter. Now here's what I knew about a sa that the town mostly didn't. On account of I shoot his horse, and a man tells his farrier things he won't tell his preacher. I knew he'd had a daughter, Mary. She'd have been about grown by the time I'm telling you of, but she didn't get to be grown. She went into the Hasyampa in a spring flood when she was 9, chasing a hat of all the fool things. A yellow hat the wind took, and the water took her, and they found her 2 miles down caught in a snag of cottonwood roots with the hat nowhere. He told me that once, flat, no more weight in his voice than if he were telling me the price of oats, and that flatness was the most frightening thing I ever heard come out of a man. He'd been a young father then. His wife never forgave the river or, I think, herself, or maybe him, and she went sickly and slow over the years and finally went altogether. And by the summer of the donkeys, a savant was a man with nobody left to lose and the bad fortune of still being alive to notice. So when he bought those donkeys, I didn't think he was simple. I thought he was a man buying himself something to be needed by. Even something stubborn. Especially something stubborn, maybe. A man like that, who'd failed to hold the one thing he loved most against the pull of moving water, maybe he wanted something that pulled so he could practice holding on. I wrote that in my ledger the night of the auction. I was 17 and full of notions, but I've read it back many times since, and I'll be damned if it wasn't the truest thing I ever guessed. He kept the donkeys in the old Mullins pen out past the smithy, which is how I came to be the one who watched the whole thing build, fidget by fidget. I've a habit, had it since I was small, of carrying a bent horseshoe nail in my pocket and turning it over and over in my fingers when I'm thinking. Tobias used to slap my hand for it. Said a farrier's hands should be still or working, nothing between. But I never broke the habit, and I bring it up because that summer my fingers had that nail worn to a shine. I worried it so much, watching a sa and his donkeys across the way. Because they would not stay put. He named them after a while. The jack he called Bishop, a big raw-boned gray with a white muzzle and a cross of darker hair over his shoulders, the way some of them have, and an air of enormous put-upon dignity, like a man wearing his good coat to a job beneath him. The 2 Jennies he called Sister and the Gray, though the gray was no grayer than the other, and I think he just ran out of the wish to name things. Sister was the small one, neat-footed, with a way of looking at you sidelong that made you check whether your buttons were done up. And the gray was old, older than the others, with a white frosted face and a milk haze starting in one eye, and she was the one, I'd swear it to this day, the gray was the one who knew. 3-4 nights a week they got out. A sa would mend the latch and they'd undo it. He wired the gate and they leaned on it till the wire bit through the post. He moved them to the corral with the good rails, and Bishop learned to lift the top rail off its pins with his teeth and his neck like he was raising a church bar. And out they'd go, all 3, single file, the gray in the lead, and they'd head north and west into the burned hills toward the Calicoes. And every time, a sa would saddle up at first light and go fetch them. And every time, they'd be a little farther out, a little higher, working up the same drainage like water running backward. And every time he'd bring them down, and the town would lean in their doorways and grin, and say there goes Vance and his lunatics. And one morning Cobb's boy, one of the few young families left, threw a clod at the gray and called a sa a name, and a sa stopped his horse and looked at that boy for a long, long moment, and didn't say anything, and the boy ran. There's a kind of looking at that's worse than any beating. The boy didn't throw any more clods. I asked him about it once. I'd shoed the off-fore on his sorrel and I was crouched there cleaning my hands on my apron, and I said, careful, "They keep heading the same way, Mr. Vance." He was quiet so long I thought he hadn't heard. Then he said, "I know it. Same line every time, north and a little west. I know it." And then, after a while, looking out at the hills the way a man looks at water, he said the thing I've turned over more times than that nail in my pocket. He said, "Hap drove those animals all over this country for 30 years. They've been every place a man can go on foot, so I keep asking myself." He stopped. "Asking yourself what, sir?" "What's up that draw," he said, "that they keep going back to, after 30 years of him driving them everywhere else? What's up there that's worth the wire cutting their lips?" I didn't have an answer. I was 17, and the answer I'd have given would have been nothing, sir. They're donkeys. I'm glad now I kept my mouth shut. Tobias always said my one virtue was that I sometimes knew when to. The thing came to its point in the second week of August, on the hottest day of that or any year I've lived through. It was the kind of heat that has a sound to it. The cicadas going like a saw blade, and under that a ringing in your own skull. The air over the road bending the world into water shapes that weren't water, never water, only the cruel idea of it. The well that morning had come up so low and so foul that Tobias poured the first bucket out into the dirt rather than let the horses have it, and stood there watching it soak away, and said a word I won't write even now. We were 3 weeks, the wise heads in town reckoned maybe 4, from having to make the decision the Hendersons and Cobbs and the rest had made, to pile up the wagon and go, to let Sweetwater finish dying behind us. And that morning the donkeys got out again, but this time they didn't go quiet in the night. This time they went at full light, in front of the whole town, and they went loud. I was at the forge when I heard the gray. A donkey's bray is an ugly thing most days, a rusty pump handle of a noise, but that morning the gray stood at the broken rail of the corral and threw her head back and let out something I'd never heard from any animal, not a bray, a call, long and climbing and desperate, again and again, until the other 2 took it up, and the 3 of them stood there screaming at the hills like something was being torn out of them. Folks came out into the road. Even half dead with the heat they came because you couldn't not. And there was a savant walking out from the Mullins place, and he stopped at the broken rail and he looked at the 3 of them, ears pinned forward, trembling, every line of them straining north and west, and something in the man's face changed. I saw it from across the road. I can't tell you what it was. A loosening, a decision. He opened the gate himself. He didn't try to fetch them or pen them or wire the rail. He stood aside and he opened the gate wide and he said something to them too low for me to hear, and the gray went through first, then Sister, then Bishop, out into the road, and they didn't run. That's the thing I keep coming back to. They didn't bolt. They waited, looking back at him over their shoulders the way a dog does when you're slow on a walk. And a savant pulled his hat down and looked at the town watching him. All of us, in our doorways, grinning even now at the end of everything. And he didn't grin back. He turned and he followed them. "Vance," Tobias called out, not unkind for once. "Vance, where in hell you going? The heat'll kill you out there." And Assass stopped, just once, and turned, and he said the last thing he said to any of us before he went up into the hills, and I have it word for word because I wrote it down within the hour. "They've been trying to tell me something all summer," he said. "I'm done being too proud to listen." Then he walked north and west out of Sweetwater behind 3 donkeys that everyone but him had given up on, into the burned hills, into that killing heat, and the dust closed up behind him like water over a stone, and most of the town turned and went back inside and said the man had finally and fully lost his mind. I didn't go back inside. I stood in the road with my bent nail going over and over in my fingers, and I watched the place where the hills had swallowed him, and I had the strangest feeling, the same feeling, I imagine, the gray had been screaming about all summer. That something was up there, and that we had all, every one of us, been too proud, or too frightened, or too far gone in our own thirst to follow. He was gone 2 days. I want to put down what those 2 days were like in town because the story usually skips them, and they matter. The story usually jumps straight to what he found, like the finding was the whole of it. But a thing isn't only what it is. It's also the waiting that bought it. The first day nobody worried. A man walks off into the hills behind his crazy donkeys, you let him. He'll get hot and thirsty and come dragging them back by dark, shamefaced, and the town'll have its laugh and that'll be the end of it. That was the first day's thinking. Tobias even bet me a dime he'd be back by supper. I didn't take the bet. I'm not sure why. My fingers wouldn't leave that nail alone. By dark he wasn't back, and the laughing got quieter. The second day it changed. Because the second day, the thing that had been a joke started to look, in the cold light of a man missing overnight in that heat with no canteen anybody'd seen him carry, like it might be about to become a tragedy. And a town that has spent all summer being cruel to a man does not like to be handed a tragedy with that cruelty still warm in its mouth. There's nothing makes folks meaner than the early stages of shame. By noon of the second day, men who'd thrown the hardest words were the loudest about how somebody ought to go look for him. Somebody ought to do something, as if the looking would scrub the words off them. Deacon Bell got up a party in the afternoon. 4 men, water, 2 rifles in case of nothing in particular. I begged to go, and Tobias, surprising me, said, "Let the boy go. He's been watching that pen like a hawk all summer. He's earned it." So I went. I rode old Deacon Bell's plow mule, the patient one, and I brought my ledger because I always do, and we went north and west into the hills following a trail that was easy at first. 6 animals leave sign, and got harder as the ground went to rock. I'll tell you about that country, since you've likely never seen the like, and I hope you never have to need to. The burned hills aren't burned. That's just what we called them. They're the Badlands skirt of the Calico Range, a country of red rock and gray rock and rock the color of a healing bruise, cut and recut by 1,000 dry washes that run maybe twice a year in a flood, and the rest of the time lie there with their mouths open, dry as old bone. Nothing grows but creosote and a mean low cactus, and in the bottoms, the gray dead-looking mesquite that turns out not to be dead at all, just patient, the most patient thing alive. There's no water. That's the whole fact of the place. There's no water, and the heat comes off the rock in the afternoon like the breath of a kiln, and the only living things are the ones built for it, the lizards, the rattlers, the buzzards going round and round overhead writing their slow, patient question in the sky. Is it dead yet? Is it dead yet? We rode under those buzzards all the second afternoon, and every man among us was thinking the same thing about them, and not one of us said it. We lost the trail at dusk in a maze of washes and made a dry camp and didn't sleep much. And in the morning, the third morning, his third day gone, we'd about decided to split up and quarter the ground when the gray came down out of the rocks to fetch us. I'm telling it plain because the plain telling is the strange part. She came down alone, that old Jenny with the milk eye, picking down a slope no shod horse could have taken, and she walked up to our cold camp and stood there and looked at us. And then she turned and went a few steps back the way she'd come and stopped and looked at us again. And Deacon Bell, who was the oldest and steadiest among us and not a fanciful man, took his hat off and said, soft, "Well, all right then. Lead on." And we followed a donkey up into the rocks. It took most of the morning. She led us up a wash and out of it, and over a saddle of red stone where we had to get down and lead the horses, and down the far side into a country that folded in on itself, narrower and narrower, the walls going up red and sheer on either hand, until we were riding single file up the bottom of a slot you'd never find unless something led you to it. Unless something that had walked this country 30 years knew the one seam in all those miles of rock where the seam went somewhere. And then the slot opened, and we came out into the box canyon, and we stopped, all of us, and nobody said anything at all. Because there was green. After 3 days of red rock and gray rock and the buzzard's patient question, the green of that canyon hit me like a hand on the chest. Cottonwoods, real ones, big ones, 3 of them, their leaves going silver green and turning in a little wind that came from somewhere, the first moving cool air I'd felt in months. Grass, actual grass, gone gold but grass. And the sound, I heard it before I understood it, and when I understood it my eyes stung and I had to look down at the mule's mane and breathe, the sound of water. Running water. A seep coming out of the base of the canyon's back wall, clear and cold and steady, pooling in a basin of stone the size of a wagon bed, and running off down a course it had cut for itself God knows how long ago, before there were any of us, before there was a town to be thirsty, water that had been running in that hidden place the whole time we'd been dying for the want of it 12 miles away. Bishop and sister were standing in the shallows of the pool, with the water up over their hooves, drinking, and they lifted their heads when we came and looked at us with no surprise at all. And under the biggest cottonwood in its shade, sitting very still and watching us come with the wide, unblinking look of a creature that has decided whether to run, was a child. A little girl. Brown as a nut, her dress gone to gray rags, her hair a wild sun-bleached tangle full of bits of leaf, her bare feet hard as a colt's hooves and her arms and legs scratched and scarred and brown, but a little girl alive, a human child where there had no business being one, 16 miles into the Badlands up a seam in the rock that took a donkey to find. She had a stick in one hand. She'd been digging with it or playing or marking. I never did learn what. She didn't move when we came. She just watched, the way the lizards watched, the way everything in that country had learned to watch, ready to be gone. And a savant came up out of the grass beside her, slow, so as not to scare her, and he had her tucked half behind him, and his face, I'd never seen his face do what it was doing. He'd been 3 days without water by any rights, and he was burnt and cracked and swaying on his feet, and his face was doing something I had no word for at 17 and have only one word for now, and the word is broken open. Like a seed. Like a thing that has to break to do what it's for. "Don't crowd her," he said, hoarse, hardly a voice left in him. She don't talk yet, don't crowd her." It was Deacon Bell who understood first. Bell was old enough. Bell had been here longer than any of us, longer than most of the dead. He came down off his horse slow, and he took his hat off again, and he walked a little way toward the child and went down on one knee in the gold grass to make himself small, and he looked at her a long time, and his old face began to come apart, and he said a name. He said Etta. And I want to tell you I understood right then, but I didn't. I was too young and too far back, and the name meant nothing to me. It was the men with me who made the sound. A sound 4 grown men made all together, a kind of groan, the sound you make when something you'd buried turns over in the ground. Because they knew the name. Everyone over a certain age in Sweetwater knew the name. Etta Mee Calloway, 8 years old, lost the spring before last in the flash flood at Coyote Wash, when the Calloway's wagon was caught crossing the dry bed by a wall of water that came down out of these very hills out of a storm nobody in town had even seen, the way they do a flood out of a clear sky, the water already on you before you hear it. Her father had got the team loose and saved himself and her mother. The child went down the wash in the brown water and the snags, and they searched, God, they searched a week, the whole town, downstream and down, and they never found her, not a rag of her. And after a week the searching stopped being searching and became the other thing, became dragging the deep holes and walking the banks looking for what the buzzards might show you, and they never found that either. And at last they held a service over an empty box, and the reverend said the words, and her mother fainted at the graveside, and her father stood like a post, and the town agreed. The way a town agrees that she was gone, was dead, was with God, and we were not to speak of it because it hurt the Calloways too much, and we put it away. We put a living child away. She'd gone up the wash, you see, not down. The water had carried her up a side branch in the first surge, the way water does things you'd never credit, and spat her out alive and alone miles from anyone. A 6-year-old, she'd been 6 alone in the Badlands, and she had not died. That was the thing that broke the whole town open when it came down to us. She had not died. She had lived up that seam in the rock by that seep nobody knew of for the better part of 2 years, on what a child can find. The canyon's grass seeds and lizards, and the things that came to water, on the water itself that never failed, and on the donkeys. The donkeys. Because Hap Mullins had found this canyon. Of course he had. 30 years in this country, the seep would have been his secret water, the reason his donkeys lived where other men's died, and he'd never told a soul because a man like Hap doesn't share water. And after he died, the donkeys remembered. They remembered the one green place, the one cold water in all that killing country, and all summer they'd been trying to get back to it, breaking the wire, lifting the rail, screaming at the hills, and somewhere in those 2 years between Hap's death and Assa's gate, those animals had found the child living there, and they had not left her. I don't know how an animal decides such a thing. Assa told me later, much later, that when he came up the canyon that first day, the three of them were standing in a ring around her where she crouched scared in the grass, between her and him, the stranger's guard, until she put her hand on the gray's leg and they let him near. They've been bringing him to her all summer. That's the truth that shocked Sweetwater to its knees and never has fully let it up. He bought 3 broken animals nobody wanted, for $1, out of his own broken want of something to need him, and they spent the last of their strength dragging him to a child. The whole town had given up for dead, 12 miles past where anyone had thought to look, because they were the only ones left who hadn't quit on her. Assa knelt down in the grass beside Deacon Bell. He'd had 3 days alone with her up there coaxing, and she'd let him close, and now he held out his cracked hand, palm up, not reaching, just open, and he said her name the way you'd say it to a wild thing, Etta. Etta me. It's all right. We're going to take you home now, and the little girl looked at all those weeping strange men and looked at the donkeys standing easy in the water and looked a long, long time at Assa Vance. And she put her small brown scarred hand in his. They didn't all come down at once. You can't move a half-wild child 16 miles of rock in an afternoon. We made a litter and didn't need it. She walked. She could outwalk any of us. That was the heartbreak and the wonder of it both. And we came down slow over 2 days, Etta riding the gray when she tired, her hand always in the old Jenny's mane, and Assa walking beside, never out of her reach, and the rest of us trailing behind feeling like we had no right to be there at all. I won't pretend the town's shock was a clean thing. I'd like to tell it pretty. I keep an honest ledger. When word ran ahead of us that Vance was coming down out of the hills with the Calloway girl alive, the town that had laughed at him 3 days before came pouring into the road, and there was joy in it, real joy, women crying and men taking their hats off, but there was the other thing under it too, the thing I'd seen starting on the second day, the shame turning to something with teeth. Because you cannot rejoice that a child was found alive without admitting in the same breath that she was alive the whole time you weren't looking, that she was 12 miles off in the hills, a small child, alone. For 2 years, while the town went about its business and called the man who found her a lunatic. The joy and the shame came up together like 2 springs out of the same rock, and Sweetwater has never, in all the years since, been able to drink from the one without tasting the other. The Calloways, Lord, I have to set that down too, though it's the hardest part. Her mother, I will not describe what her mother did when she saw her. It's not mine to give away, except to say that some sounds a person makes belong only to them, and I shut my ledger and looked at the ground. But her father. Here is the morally heavy thing, the thing that turned the homecoming from a miracle into something the town has argued in low voices ever since. Cal Calloway, Etta's father, had got the team loose in the flood and saved himself and his wife. And that was no sin. A man does what he can in a wall of water. But Cal Calloway had also been the one, after 3 days of searching, who'd first said out loud what nobody wanted to say, that she was surely gone, that to keep on was cruelty to his wife, that they had to let her be dead so they could go on living. He'd been the one to push the empty service. The town had let him, had been glad to let him, because he was the grieving father, and who were they to question how a man grieved? And now here she came, alive, down out of the hills on the back of a dead prospector's donkey, led by the town fool, and she would not go to him. That's the part the story leaves out mostly because it's the part that doesn't forgive. When they brought her in and her mother had hold of her and the first storm of it had passed, her father came forward and the child shrank. She didn't scream or run. She just went still and small and turned her face into her mother's dress and reached, blind with her free hand, not for her father, for Asa Vance, who she'd known 3 days. She reached past the father, who'd let her be buried, for the stranger who'd come up the canyon and refused to. Now a child that age, 2 years feral, who's to say what she remembered or understood? A kind man would say she was only frightened of a stranger's grown face, that the father was as much a stranger to her now as anyone, that no blame attached. A kind man would say that. I have tried to be a kind man. But I saw Cal Calloway's face when his daughter wouldn't come to him, and I saw that he understood something about himself in that moment that he would carry to his grave, and I have never been able to make the kind man's argument carry the whole weight. The town never could either. The Calloways moved on within the year, the whole family, to start where the story wasn't. I hope they found it. I don't know that they did. But this is a Saz story and the donkeys, so let me bring it home. The spring saved Sweetwater. That part is simple and good, and I'm glad to write it down after the rest. There was water in those hills, cold, clean, faithful water, 12 miles off, and now we knew the way. The men who could ride went up with picks and tools, and they found that the seep ran far stronger than one canyon could use, and within 2 years there was a pipe and a flume and a ditch bringing Calico water down to Sweetwater, and the creek that had given us our name ran again, after a fashion, and the cottonwoods in town leafed out, and the families that had left, some of them came back. The town didn't die. It's not much of a town even now, I'll grant you, but it's a living one, and it's living on water that 3 donkeys remembered when every man in it had forgot how to look for any. Here's the morally heavy thing for Asa, the one I promised you and have been carrying all this while. He'd meant to keep it. He told me this himself, years on, the one time I ever got him to tell it whole, an old man by then with his hands gone bad and me, a grown farrier with my own forge. He told me that when he first followed the donkeys up that seam and came out into the green and the cold water and the cottonwoods, before he ever saw the child, there was a moment, he said, a long moment where he stood in that hidden water and thought, I'll never tell them. He was done with Sweetwater. Done with the town that had laughed and the well that tasted of graves and the road he couldn't walk down without passing the years of his losses. He thought he'd found his ending. He'd bring the donkeys and what little he owned, and he'd live out his days in that secret green place by the faithful water, alone, needed by 3 animals and needing nothing else, and let the town die 12 miles off for all he cared. Let it die. It had given him nothing but to bury. He stood in the water, he said, and he made that choice to keep it, to let them all go thirsty, and he was at peace with it. And then he heard a sound in the grass, and he turned, and there was a child watching him. So you see, he told me, his bad hands folded, they didn't lead me to water. Any fool can find water if he's pointed at it. They led me to her, and she's the one led me back down, because the day I found her was the day I couldn't keep the canyon a secret anymore, couldn't keep her a secret, and the minute I knew I had to bring her down to her people, well. He smiled, the only time I ever truly saw him do it, a small crooked thing. Then I had to bring the water down too, didn't I? Couldn't very well save the child and let the rest of them die of the thirst I'd planned on. One thing pulls the next. That's the trouble with letting yourself be needed, son. You think it's just the one. It's never just the one. He kept the donkeys, of course, to the end. Bishop and sister lived long, donkeys do, and outlasted Asa himself by some years, and were fed and let be by the town like the holy things they half were. The gray, the old one, the milk-eyed one, the one I'd always sworn was the one who knew, she died that first winter, quiet in the Mullins pen, of nothing but age, and having done the thing she was for. Asa buried her himself up the canyon by the water under the cottonwoods. He wouldn't let anyone help, and he wouldn't say why, and I didn't ask. I think I knew. There's a place a thing belongs. I've gone up there only the once years ago to see it. The water still runs. The cottonwoods are bigger, and there's no marker on the Gray's grave, but you can see where it is, because there's a patch of grass up there that comes in greener than the rest every spring, and folks who don't know the story think it's the seep makes it so. It isn't the seep's the other way. But I never tell them that. Some things a person ought to be left to wonder at, some things you don't spell out. What I'll tell you instead is the thing I started with, that I keep an honest ledger, and that the entry for that August never would balance, the cost against the worth, the laughter against the grief, the man who meant to disappear and was dragged back into the world by 3 stubborn animals and a child who wouldn't quit being alive. It doesn't balance. I've stopped trying to make it. But I'll tell you the last of it, and then I'll let you be. The night they brought Etta down, after the storm of it, after the Calloways had taken her in and the town had gone quiet, I went out to the smithy late, the way I do, and Asaph Vance was sitting on the rail of the Mullins pen in the dark with his 3 donkeys, and I came up and stood by him, and we didn't talk for a long while. And finally I said the only thing I had, which was, "How'd you know, Mr. Vance? How'd you know to follow?" And he was quiet, looking at them in the dark, the big gray shape of Bishop and the 2 Jennies, and at last he said,